Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the KULS ESG Forum's webinar series. Thank you for joining us nice and bright and early today. My name is Ami Kotecha, and I'm chair of the ESG Forum and co-founder at Amro Partners. For those of you who are not familiar with the KULS ESG Forum's work, we try and host a webinar every couple of months, focusing on a topic around sustainability, environmental, social, and governance issues. And we try and bring out topics that are wide-ranging enough to cover the interest of our KULS members and the wider Savills community. We're very, very appreciative of Savills being our sponsors right from the start of this series. And we try to focus on intersectionalities on all these issues and bring about some thought leadership, which perhaps gives you a more unique perspective than you would get in other forums. Today, I'm really pleased to have Munish Datta, who is one of our committee members at the forum, chair and moderate this session. And we have expert panelists, Nikki Rust, Bruce Lascelles, and Claudine Blamey, who are all joining us to discuss the topic of today's webinar, which is alternative uses for rural land. With that, I'd like to hand over to Munish and ask him to kick off the session. Thank you, Munish.
Thanks, Ami, and welcome everyone. Great to be here with you today. So land is often referred to as our planet's carbon sink. And according to the UN, in the last decade alone, land-based ecosystems have absorbed around 30% of carbon emissions generated by human activities, primarily from burning fossil fuels. But our land is under increasing pressure from things like deforestation, urbanization, industrial development, agricultural expansion, and unsustainable farming practices. And all this is undermining land's ability to provide those crucial ecosystem services, such as food, maintaining fresh water, forest resources, and regulating the climate and air quality. And in fact, today it's calculated that up to 40% of the world's land has been degraded, including 30% of cropland and 10% of pasture land. And without efforts to restore and protect land, 70 gigatons more carbon could be emitted by 2050 due to land use change and soil degradation, representing about 17% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. But there is also an economic imperative. The economic gains from land restoration, including its impact on emission cuts and prevention of biodiversity loss, is massive. It could amount to something like $140 trillion per year, which is 50% more than the global GDP in 2021. This is exactly why we're joined by an outstanding panel to discuss what is the most environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable use for rural land. How can we attain the right balance between using land for nature, for food, for energy, built environment, given its very, very huge value to us? So each of our panelists will introduce themselves and offer a short perspective, after which we'll go into a really interactive discussion and Q&A. Please, please, please post your comments and questions in the chat. I'm delighted to welcome them. Welcome Dr. Nikki Rust, Head of Land, Agriculture and Nature at the Climate Change Committee, Dr. Bruce Lascelles, Director of Sustainable Land Management at Arcadis and past President of the British Society of Soil Science, and Claudine Blamey, Group Director of Sustainability at Aviva Investors. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Nikki, to kick us off, and then Bruce, then Claudine. Thanks.
Brilliant. Well, good morning, everyone. And I'm delighted to be here with you all today. So I work at the Climate Change Committee, or the CCC, as we sometimes call it. And for those of you who haven't heard of us, we have the wonderful job of giving advice and recommendations to the UK government, Parliament, and the devolved nations on climate mitigation and adaptation. And we are actually written into the Climate Change Act. So it's a fantastic role. And I am Head of Land, Agriculture and Nature, which is a new team that was brought together last year so that we can start integrating nature into our role. So what I cover is how best we can use the UK's land to adapt to climate change, as well as reach net zero from land, agriculture and nature perspective. So land is such a finite resource in the UK. And as you'll probably know, about 70% of our land is used for agriculture currently. So agriculture is such an important part of when we think about how exactly we use our rural land to produce all of the goods that we need, for example, on climate, on nature, to produce food for rural housing, air and water quality, and many other things as well. So we are asking a lot of our rural spaces. And that's why it's so important for the government's forthcoming land use framework, which we hope will ultimately cover all of this multifunctionality of England's land. There are going to have to be some very tough decisions that need to be made on how exactly we manage our land use. And this is especially so because we now have statutory targets that the government must reach, both on climate and nature. So rural land is going to have to play a big part of this. But how we fund this is going to be tough. We really need to rely on both public and private funds here. And of course, carbon credits can help here, but they do come with some risks and potentially some perverse outcomes, such as the possibility for green leds to be buying up huge tracts of land that could have massive socioeconomic implications for the rural economy. So we really need to ensure a just rural transition to reach our climate and nature goals. Now, financing is going to play a big part in enabling this just transition, but it does require some thought, which hopefully we can dig into later today. And I think we also need to consider that there's a massive hole in funding for climate adaptation. There's been a lot of focus on net zero, but not so much on how we adapt to climate change. Now, whilst I talk here a lot about what land can produce for us, we also need to consider the demand side as well, as the demand for the produce from land is a big driver of rural land use and is adding complexity to all of this. And it's also added to the complexity that we are part of a globalized world here, and what happens overseas with production and consumption very much influences what we do with our land in the UK. Now, currently, we're consuming unsustainably in the UK. And when we think of agriculture, this is especially so for livestock production. So 60% of agricultural land in the UK is used for livestock. And as you may know, enteric fermentation from ruminants, which is just a fancy way of saying sheep and cow burps, encompass about 50% of agricultural emissions. So when we think about the future of rural land use in the UK, we also need to consider what future consumption looks like in order to help to transition so that it benefits climate, nature, health, and many other things as well. Now, as we race towards reaching net zero goals, we really must ensure that we are not offshoring our environmental damage elsewhere. So this is a really complex problem. We have to think big picture here. Now, I apologise that my intro is mostly going to be focusing on the problems that we've got here and potentially offering some questions rather than answers, but hopefully we can dig into that as the session goes on. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. That's a great start. I'm going to hand over to Bruce now to provide your perspective.
Yeah, thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. And again, it's great to be part of this discussion, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel. So I'm Bruce Lascelles. I'm UK Director of Sustainable Land Management at Arcadis, and I'm the current past president of the British Society of Soil Science. So for those of you not familiar with those two organisations, Arcadis is a consultancy, design and engineering consultancy, working in both natural and built assets sort of fields, and our tagline is improving quality of life. And the British Society of Soil Science is an organisation committed to the study of soil, but in its widest aspect. So it brings together those working in academia, practitioners implementing soil science in industry, and those working with and with an interest in soils. And I'm a soil scientist, and I spent a lot of my career surveying and trying to understand soils and assessing how land use change both affects soils and the wider natural environment, but also how a healthy, functioning natural environment underpinned by those healthy soils can facilitate and support sustainable land use change. And a lot of my work has focused on habitat creation and restoration. So I've worked very closely with ecologists, with hydrologists, with landscape architects, and so on. And also work very hard to try to raise a voice for soils, promoting the really critical importance of this resource for our sustainable future. And I think this is clearly going to be a theme that's going to come out from the discussions already. And unfortunately, soil science has often been referred to as the Cinderella science. It's never had the focus that other parts of essentially our life support system, so air, water, and biodiversity, have had. But healthy soils and the land use they support are absolutely central to our sustainable future. and central to our ability to benefit from that multifunctional landscape. And I think from my perspective, this is perhaps where our focus needs to be now, looking at how a healthy and functioning natural system can support those multiple benefits and services in any one location. And I think that's really important, because we've got to be location specific, that old adage, the right trees in the right place and so on. And I think if we can do that, we can then start to open up opportunities for land use change, which really do maximize the benefits for everyone. And one of the challenges we have is evidence in proving that what we're saying, what we're recommending works. And this is really, really important. So we need that body of evidence to demonstrate that what can often be seen as intuitive can be proven to bring the benefit. So linking science with a much wider audience is going to be absolutely critical to the success of this. And we've got to find better ways to do that. And again, I hate to say it, but soils don't generally look very good. They're brown, very difficult to photograph. They have these connotations of dirt, mud, etc. with them. So we've got to find ways to link those, the science, the understanding of soils with a much wider audience. And one thing that the British Society of Soil Science were able to do, we had the honour of hosting, on behalf of the International Union of Soil Sciences, the 22nd World Congress of Soil Science last summer in Glasgow. And in putting together the week-long programme, we were very mindful of that sort of communication engagement piece. And so while central to the Congress was the dissemination and discussion around scientific studies, we did two further things. Firstly, we worked with partners across the arts community to put on a range of activities to find other means of talking about soil. So through culture, through pottery, interactive events, film, storytelling and plays. And I think those were hugely important and will continue to be hugely important. And secondly, we held, which was the first time it's been done at the World Congress, a full day focused on policy. So we brought together an international panel and audience to share experiences and discuss the way forward for soil policy. And that was hugely successful. It was standing room only. And I'm very conscious in this discussion, I will very often refer to soil, but soil in the context of what we're talking about here underpins the land, underpins that land use. And so it's really, really important. And so those are really sort of perhaps the other important parts of the jigsaw, that communication and engagement, because we're talking about change and we've got to ensure that change is understood and therefore can be accepted. And we've got to have that strong policy, legislation and incentivization, which again has already been mentioned, to drive and support that change that we need to see.
Thanks, Bruce. It is said, isn't it, that there are more living organisms in 1 tablespoon of soil than there are people on Earth. So that's, I'm always amazed by that fact. Handing over to you, Claudine, for your perspective, please.
Great. Thanks, Munish. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I bring a more biodiversity perspective to this. So just, I'm Group Director of Sustainability at Aviva. And those of you who don't know, Aviva is one of the most leading companies in the UK on insurance. We also have an investment arm and various other bits and pieces like pensions and things. So we have various views on all of this, but I come at this from a very much a biodiversity perspective. So Aviva is committed to be net zero carbon by 2040. That's not an easy task, I can tell you that. It's very difficult to reduce all the carbon that we've got to reduce. And it's not just our carbon, it's obviously the carbon that we influence, so within our supply chain, within all the different investments, and all of that, there are different mechanisms we're trying to use to be able to reduce that, and our ambition being to get there by 2040. We know, and scientists have also said, that the world will not get to net zero carbon without nature-based solutions, without elements, and some of them might not be nature-based, but just literally removing carbon from the atmosphere. So as a part of that, we've been very engaged in the biodiversity debate. So the run up to COP15, for example, last year, we produced our biodiversity report, and we had set already our biodiversity policy in 2021. The report is very much about providing how we've got on with that policy, and for people who are interested, that's on our website. But as a part of that, we set lots of commitments as well, including in our investments side, in our underwriting, in the insurance side as well, to increase biodiversity and to invest in organisations that are doing some great things around biodiversity. And we've in fact created a fund, and I can talk a little bit about that later. But I guess the point for me is that there is room for understanding what bits of land can contribute to increasing biodiversity, and particularly to not just that element, but also removing carbon. But I guess they're not two different things for us. The projects, which I'm sure I'll get an opportunity to talk about later, that we've committed to are projects with partners that take the carbon out of the atmosphere, but also contribute huge amounts to biodiversity, also create these wonderful places that people can go and visit. And we know that that has other health impacts and so on for communities. I think just going back to why we're doing this and what's the benefit. I see biodiversity and climate change as two sides of the same coin. After all, it was mismanagement of nature that's led to climate change. So we've got to use nature as part of the solution going forward, and for so many reasons that all have already been outlined, and you very eloquently talked about, Munish, in your introduction. So I think that's kind of our view, and I'm sure through questions we'll go more into detail about Aviva. But I just wanted to talk about my own personal point of view as well. I've been really interested in biodiversity, in land management throughout my career, particularly when I was at the Crown Estate. We did lots of work around soil health with our farmers, and increasing biodiversity in that space. But I must say that we mustn't forget the urban areas, that urban spaces have a lot to add to this as well. And when I was at the Crown Estate, we created the Wild West End, which was a great project that brought all partners together across the whole of Regent Street, from St James's Park all the way to Regent's Park, to create a wildlife corridor. And that was through all sorts of different elements. And Bruce, you talk about engagement. I think engagement needs to be far and wide, and knowledge development needs to be far and wide. And these sorts of projects create that atmosphere to be able to increase knowledge, increase engagement, because it is really important that people are connected to nature wherever they are, to be able to then understand that. I think the other thing I'm really passionate about is this land framework. I think we need this framework to be able to then operate within that and not deliver things that have unintended consequences. And some of that was mentioned earlier as well. And I think that would help us from an investment perspective, being able to invest in the right places for the right purposes, and bring that public and private partnerships together to do that, because we're very keen to deliver on that. And lastly, I just want to end with, we've committed 100 million to nature-based solutions by 2030, and some of those we've already been able to deliver on. So we've just committed 38 million to wildlife trusts for temperate rainforests to be created back in the UK. We only have 1% of temperate rainforests left in the UK, and they used to cover the whole of the west side of the UK. So that's going to hopefully increase that 1% by working with the Wildlife Trust. There are other examples I can talk about later, Munish, but I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thanks, Claudine. Lots of really practical examples from your wide-ranging experience. Really appreciate those. I'm going to come back to you, Nikki, and perhaps pick up on the point that Claudine was making, and also thank those that have posed questions, please continue to keep those coming. We'll come to them in a bit, but let's just start with a bit of a discussion. Let's just start with the discussion around land use policy and incentives and around that land use framework that Claudine just referred to. What needs to happen there, and what does it mean for the built environment in particular? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And indeed, Bruce and Claudine, if you want to come in afterwards, please do.
Absolutely. So the land use framework is being led by DEFRA. We hear at the CCC that apparently it will be coming out at some time later this year, and we hear that it will be addressing the multifunctionality that's needed from our land. I'm not entirely certain if it will include the urban areas, as concurrently, as you may know, there's also some work going on at DLUC that is looking into planning, particularly in urban areas as well. But what I would say is what the CCC would hope to come out of this framework is that it is very interlinked, and that departments that have historically worked a little bit more in silos are now integrating together, as we realise that there is so much overlap and that nature covers everything, climate covers everything. And so we have to mainstream both of these aspects into all of our policy. And what I would say in terms of more generally what's needed around policies and incentives, primarily is more funding. So the CCC did a land use report in 2020, and we found that there was a funding shortfall of around 1.4 billion a year to fund efforts to both reach net zero as well as adapt to climate change. And just to put that into context, the Common Agricultural Policy funding in 2018 was 3.3 billion. So it's not huge, and actually this would produce over 4 billion a year in benefits for public goods. So for our health and well-being, as well as many other things for nature and climate. And as I mentioned earlier, we do need a mix of both public and private funding, but lots of studies have shown that actually it's more effective if most of this does come from the public purse. Now, historically, much more of the focus has been on mitigation, and now there's beginning to be a bit more on nature, which is fantastic. But again, adaptation is still left on the back burner as a little bit of an afterthought. So what I would also say is we really need policies to step up to climate adaptation to make sure, again, related to that rural just transition, that we're not leaving people behind and that people are properly protected against the effects of climate change, as well as nature as well. For instance, if our peatlands dry up due to droughts related to climate change, this is going to release a huge amount of greenhouse gases. And so all of these things are absolutely interlinked. Humans are part of nature, we're affecting climate change, but we all need to work together to address these multiple issues. Now, just one final point, that it's not just about funding to get to net zero and to solve the biodiversity crisis. One of the other key aspects here is addressing the workforce. We need far more people adequately trained in green jobs and skills. So this requires a massive focus going forward. Now, just a couple of months ago, the CCC released a report on green jobs and skills and found huge opportunities for the economy to invest in these, but we need the right government incentives and policies to enable that. So I'll just leave that there and hand over to others.
Thanks, Nikki. Bruce, would you like to comment?
Yeah, there's little I can say to that. I agree absolutely with everything Nikki said. I absolutely that piece around adaptation. The focus has always been on mitigation. The climate is changing; it will go on changing, and in that just transition piece, we've got to be able to secure that adaptation so we can continue to live in the landscapes that we currently do. The other point, just to add to, was that skills gap, and yeah, definitely. And from a soils perspective, we've seen that, and we need a step change. There are huge opportunities in terms of the economy and green jobs. And one thing from a soil perspective, we're working with IFATES to develop a new soil science apprenticeship, a level 7, so that's sort of MSc type level. And we've had huge support for that from industry across the UK. And we've got to see more of those things being done. But yeah, we need that land use framework to and other policy to be real core drivers for that change to really kind of, get that going.
Right, thanks, Bruce. I'm gonna touch on slightly the topic of one of the questions that's come through around biodiversity offsets and just offsets more generally. Of course, none of us will have escaped that recent investigation that The Guardian led that found that a leading provider of carbon credits, particularly from forest carbon offsets, found that 90% of them do not represent real emission reductions and are effectively greenwash. I'd like to perhaps start with you again, Nikki, and then Claudine and Bruce. Just, what needs to change in that sort of market to try and make this more authentic and more additional as opposed to what it is at the moment, clearly?
Yeah, so as you rightly pointed out, there are big challenges currently with carbon credits, and we urgently need to address them because significantly more funding is needed to immediately avert the climate disaster as well as the nature emergency. But decades of research into REDD, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, has shown that there are many pitfalls, but also some good practices around these carbon credits. So I would suggest that voluntary schemes must be brought together into a national scheme like we have in the UK for the woodland code, the peatland code, and the emerging soil carbon code as well. So some of the issues around carbon credits have been around additionality. So what would have happened if these credits hadn't been issued? And sometimes, like was pointed out in The Guardian, the work would have happened anyway, so they don't actually represent any additional savings, and it's not good value for money, which is putting investors off. This is not good for anyone. So we need much better governance. Now, there's some great work being done by the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, and they're developing a claims code of practice to guide credible voluntary use of carbon credits and associated claims. But like I say, I would suggest that actually a national oversight would be useful here. And ultimately, if voluntary carbon markets are genuinely trying to reach net zero, businesses must also support direct decarbonisation of their operations and supply chains. So the role of these carbon credits should be to support and not discourage actual reductions in emissions.
Thanks, Nikki. Claudine, I know you've got experience of very recent work that you referred to in terms of the funds you've created. What lessons have you learned from this, and what can you share?
Yeah, so there's lots to talk about around that. Just referring to what Nikki just said as well before I get into what Aviva's doing. So I was involved in delivering the EasyJet's net zero carbon strategy. So, and we did a lot of work on trying to make sure that the credits that were being bought were legitimate as much as possible, as much as you possibly can. What I do like to say is that one of the biggest risks of deforestation in the world at the moment is beef production in Brazil. And we really need to get our heads around how we can manage that and stop that from more deforestation, because we really can't deal with any more of those forests going and that the carbon not being absorbed into those fabulous natural places. So, and I do think there is a place for voluntary carbon offsets as a part of that to fund those, but obviously that's not the only solution. There does need to be a solution for that. So at Aviva, we obviously are aware of all that, and as I came in, I had that experience in terms of it's very difficult to find credits that are actually going to remove carbon from the atmosphere and deliver that additionality, which is why we've chosen to work with some very good partners, particularly in the UK and in Canada now as well. So in the UK, we have committed to that 100 million by 2030, and so far we've working with the wildlife trusts, as I said, to create the temperate rainforests. We've given 10 million to the Woodland Trust for peatland conservation, but also woodlands, and all of those follow the codes that Nikki just mentioned, the woodland code and the peatland code. And also, we've working with WWT, the wetland trusts, and we've given them, I think that was last week, 21 million for salt marsh recreation, protection, etc. And I think, and we'll carry on. There's lots we're doing as well. I think we also have put some money in our Viva Community Fund, and we worked with WWF on wild isles recently. And so communities in local areas can apply and use that for biodiversity purposes within their communities. Lots of that is all about making sure that you're working with the right partners. So all of the partners I mentioned have been around for a long time, and they're going to be around for a long time. The lessons learned was we've now got a 100-year contract in place with the wildlife trusts. And I was talking to the wildlife trust chief exec yesterday, and he was saying he had to take a sip of whiskey before he signed that contract, because that's the first time ever such a big amount of money has been donated for this kind of purpose, and the first time ever he would have signed that kind of contract. And we've learned so much through that process in terms of what happens with the legal stuff, and it wasn't easy. You know, it took months and months to try and get to the right point. What happens? Can we make sure that it is long-standing, that they do deliver the biodiversity and the carbon elements out of those projects? And it's tough. It is tough, but I think doing it in this way, at least you know that you can trust the partner you're working with, and it's delivering not just carbon removals. That's the other really, really good point, that it is increasing biodiversity that's disappearing, that we need so much for other purposes, for other reasons, such as food production, etc. But also it's providing amenities. People can go and see these places, people can enjoy them as well.
Thanks, Claudine, and thanks for all the questions that are coming through, and indeed to our panelists who are dual tasking and not just live answering, but also answering and typing. I do really appreciate it. Bruce, I want to come back to you. There's a point that keeps being made around sort of food and diet, and I think you mentioned this, and Nikki, it'd be great to get your perspective as well, in terms of changing consumer demand, which I think you talked about as well. Any thoughts on, you know, the role of that in how we use our land and what we use our land for, and indeed going back to soils and preserving our soils?
Yeah, I think consumer demand has to play a part in this, and this comes back maybe to the raising awareness, to engagement piece, to really, I think it's been mentioned before, to link people back to the environment, and you know, I think it's well understood that we've become disengaged with the environment, with where our food comes from, and so I think there's a really, really strong piece there. I think also then part of that then is thinking about where food comes from. There is this traditional sense that rural, that's where farming happens, urban, that's where we live, and it's already been mentioned, but or touched upon, but I think bringing both biodiversity, but as part of that, bringing food production back into our urban centres has to be part of the future. And part of that is going to be that consumer demand and that consumer acceptance that that's a good thing. And within that, and particularly thinking about on a global level, I think the current number of cities that are defined as mega cities is around 30 odd. I think by the end of the century, it's going to be plus 80. And I think the statistics suggest that Lagos in Nigeria is going to be the largest, with, you know, a city with, I can't remember, it's 85 million inhabitants. The land within reach of that city is not going to be able to support that population. And so as part of that acceptance, food production's got to come into that urban centre, but it's got to be then supported by a circular economy, recycling of waste materials within that urban centre to provide the nutrients, the media in which crops are grown within that environment. And that again is also going to require a change of perception and a change of acceptance in how our food is grown, where it comes from, and so on.
Thanks, Bruce. Nikki, you wanted to come in.
Absolutely. So the CCC has done a lot of work on food and diets and the effects that this has on our land use and our emissions. And increasingly, we're doing work on how this is affecting nature as well. So as I mentioned in my intro, 70% of UK's land is for agriculture, 60% of which is for livestock, 50% of our emissions come from ruminants. And so as Claudine rightly pointed out, meat is an important part of getting to net zero, to a nature positive future, and to adapting to climate change, as well as making sure that we are healthy and that we are living long lives that have reduced amounts of morbidity as well. So the CCC have suggested a 20% reduction in meat to get to net zero. And we are not going as far as some of the people out there like the Eat Lancet diet, which have an extremely small amount of suggested meat in their diets. We're saying stick to recommended daily allowance, about 70 grams of meat a day, which is really beneficial for your health as well as for the environment. So we are not saying everyone needs to go vegan. And meat is an important part of people's diets. It is socially and culturally important as well. We're also not saying we need to get rid of livestock. I know that there's been a lot of scaremongering in the media recently, and there's been some things happening in Ireland and in the Netherlands, which is really getting farmers' backs up, rightly so. I completely understand that sustainable livestock management can be important in terms of nature recovery. For instance, if we have low intensity grazing on grasslands, that can sometimes be beneficial for, say, butterflies and such. But we need to get back to the point that we do currently over consume meat, and this is bad for our health and it's bad for our planet. So we do need to gradually reduce that meat consumption, primarily red meat, because it has such an impact both on our health and on the environment. And that's especially for health, it's especially for processed. So again, not saying give up meat, just saying that, for instance, if you're having spaghetti bolognese, that as part of that mince that you're putting in there, perhaps you could replace 20% of that mince with lentils. And I'm also not suggesting that we turn to ultra processed foods, like some of these, seitan and tofu and things like that. We need to rely more on peas and beans and homegrown things that can sequester carbon, that can be really beneficial for our nitrogen. So we're not putting extra fertilizers in. There definitely are really fantastic win-wins here for our health and for the environment.
Great, Nikki. Who thought we'd get dietary advice as well as advice about how to use land? It's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. I want to turn my attention slightly to land ownership and the economics of this. And there's been a couple of questions from Peter Mitchell and Jock Eldon that sort of point to this. So does the panel think the current forms of land ownership are compatible with an optimized multifunctional landscape is being recommended and advocated for? And then Jock asks, given the current challenging economic environment and the challenges around funding and inflation, what advice would the panel give to landowners looking for alternative uses of land? So can I come to you, Claudine, first, or Bruce? Bruce, you've come off on mute, so perhaps you want to come first, then Claudine.
I've been very, very quick there. Just on that first question from Peter on current forms of land ownership, something I just wanted to highlight. It is a problem. I don't think I've got the answer to it, but one point to highlight in that the majority of our land is in private ownership, and therefore trying to tell someone what to do with their land is difficult. We back in 2012 or something, there was a European soil framework directive proposed. In 2016 or so, it was shelved because the support wasn't there. And disappointingly, the UK were one of the key opponents of that framework directive. And my understanding is that was around land ownership, not wanting to tell people what to do with their land, and also part within that contaminated land, and not wanting to try to or have to force people to clean up land, maybe that it's historical contamination that wasn't their fault and so on. So it is a problem, and it has definitely held back progress in terms of soil policy, in terms of soil legislation and so on. I don't have the answer to the issue of private ownership, but part of it is going to be around that piece around engagement and around incentivization as well. And I think if we can engage, increase knowledge, but also pay farmers and land managers appropriately for carbon as well as biodiversity, etc., is going to have to be part of that solution.
Right, thanks, Bruce. Claudine, were you wanting to come in?
Yeah, I think I agree with I agree with all that. I think very little to add, but maybe around the biodiversity net gain. I think there's a real opportunity for landowners managing their land really well to be able to participate in that biodiversity net gain, and increasing biodiversity and diversifying their land. That could be an interesting business model for them as well.
Thank you, Claudine. Let's turn to the sort of more social aspects of this, and you've all kind of referred to them in different ways. And I wanted to touch on some of the theme of questions that are coming through, but around the social implications of sustainable land use practices, but particularly in terms of engaging local communities. Claudine, you gave a great example of the work that you did at Crown Estate, but I wonder if there are other lessons, if we start with you, Nikki, that need to be adopted, and then we'll come on to the others, around engagement of people, which is so critical.
Absolutely. So perhaps it's easier for me to say what we shouldn't be doing, which is not engaging local communities. That's really not the way that we deal with these issues, and that's definitely not a just transition. So absolutely, we need to be starting to do more participatory approaches to democracy. There's been some fantastic things done with NGOs around the country that have created citizens' assemblies, and actually there's probably a lot that we could learn from Henry Dimbleby's approach to his food strategy, where he and his team went all around the country and they held conversations to really understand what the general public think about these issues and the solutions that can be made in a local context. So I think that the local context is absolutely key here, because different interventions will work differently in different places. And so what perhaps may work in the Highlands of Scotland may not work in the Fens of East Anglia. And equally, culturally, they are exceptionally different as well. So by really fully embedding a participatory approach to reaching net zero, to addressing the nature emergency, we are hopefully starting to understand and address those local situations, which can create much more sustainable solutions that do begin to understand the socio-economic and ecological differences that we have around the UK.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to come in on the sort of social aspects of this, Bruce?
Yeah, I think one way to look at this is we need to be driving the conversations into a systems thinking approach, and within that system we are simply one component of that. Maybe need to think of that as equal to everything else. Everything has to be working and happy and healthy within that system to make it work. And I agree absolutely. We've got to ensure that in the discussions and in the land use planning discussions, we don't fall into siloed thinking and siloed working where one aspect takes dominance and to the detriment of others. And I think if we have that systems thinking approach, we will drive ourselves out of silo, or out of the risk of working in silos. And that in that system, we've got to then draw on that local knowledge. We need the scientists to be driving evidence-based, but we've also got to link that science back to local communities. I've done so many soil surveys across land, and when you go onto land and you talk to the farmer, he knows exactly where the wet patch is, where the crops haven't grown, as well as everything else, and draw on that knowledge. It will be really, really important.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Let's turn our attention to adaptation and the use of nature-based solutions, which again has been referred to and is a theme in the questions. I like this comment stroke question from Kevin Kennedy. Thank you, Kevin, for showing your appreciation for today's session. Are we not already seeing adaptation happening, e.g. the growth of British vineyards? But that brings unintended consequences, right, in terms of dependence on water, which is, we know, incredibly scarce. I just wonder if there were any solutions, any practical examples that any of the panel can offer in terms of really good quality nature-based solutions that are out there that our attendees can sort of look into. Nikki?
I'm happy to initially take that if you like. You may have seen in the news just today that there's been a wine estate that has got an award for its sparkling white wine that's being produced in the south of England. So absolutely, some land managers and farmers are already adapting, which is great, but a lot more needs to be done. And we at the CCC do monitor progress towards adapting to climate change, and my team specifically looks at the land and agricultural sectors adapting to climate change, and unfortunately largely not so much. So definitely a lot more needs to be done. As I mentioned earlier, there is such an important role that policy and incentives can play there. I do think that comms can be really important here too, because I'm not entirely sure if some land managers and farmers are aware of just the risks involved in not adapting to climate change. And so one of the things that we are suggesting at the CCC is for there to be a sort of a farm scale risk assessment done that can be very quick and easy, but useful to the land manager or farmer, to see where are my risks in the business, and to have a proper evidence-based approach to working out how to adapt. So there could be simple things like water storage that could be put onto the farm, so helping in periods of drought. Agroforestry is so crucial here as well, and that's got multiple benefits for mitigation, adaptation, and nature. Hedgerows really are great too as well, fantastic for biodiversity, and they can provide shade for livestock, and if planted in the right places can also reduce flooding as well. So there are some really fantastic approaches out there. And I'd also say as well that because climate change impacts are already beginning to be a big problem in the equators, we could look to other countries to see what they're doing in terms of climate smart agriculture as well.
Thanks, Nikki. Fantastic. Again, the theme of diet and food, and this time wine, which is great to hear. Claudine, in your various initiatives that you've launched in the last few months, can you tell us a bit more about the sort of adaptation and nature-based approach that you've taken in them?
Yeah, sure. They all have resilience elements to them. As Nikki mentioned, I think we are already seeing the impacts of climate change here in the UK, but obviously around the world there are a lot more serious elements going on that are impacting in very serious ways. So I think in the UK, with all the projects we've got, including the temperate rainforests, they all add resilience elements to that, to the UK. And again, I should have mentioned that before, but that is the other principle that we have with every project that we do, that it needs to have resilience benefits, helping the UK adapt to climate change impacts in the future. And they are, I think nature and nature-based solutions have a huge part to play in this. And this is where I think, again, regulation can help, bringing private funding and partnerships with local areas to try and find solutions for that. I think things like the Climate Transition Plan and Transition Plan Task Force work, nature needs to be part of all of that, and at the moment it isn't playing a huge part. So in our own climate transition plan, we are going to, this year, we're going to include biodiversity and nature as a part of that. So that would be interesting for, I guess, for us and for everybody else to see that, how that marries up to try and deliver that adaptation, that resilience.
Thanks, Claudine. Great examples there. Bruce, I want to come to you about the connection of resilience and adaptation and maintaining the quality of soil. I think that's something that you perhaps touched on earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to sort of offer another kind of example of natural flood management, which I think sits very firmly in that area around adaptation, but also the multiple benefits. then there are some really great examples from around the country of where natural flood management has been used and has demonstrably made a difference to flooding incidents in local communities. And again, I think this is a really good example where it is local. It's very, these are very, very small scale interventions. They have a very clear community benefit, but also they have a biodiversity, or are very likely to have a biodiversity benefit, but in particular then also from my perspective have a benefit to soil, because we are putting water where it should go, back into the soil, back into the groundwater. And probably the result of these sorts of interventions is that you also then get a change in the vegetation community, you get an increase in soil carbon within that area. And it's not mutually exclusive that you can't then have agriculture in those areas. Again, that you can still have livestock, you can still crop them. And again, maybe it also comes back to this sort of idea about engagement, understanding that there will be consequences of that. You will have parts of the year when that land is slightly wetter. So it's working out how to work with that, how to compensate and incentivize the relevant farmer and landowner to do that. And I know from working with the Environment Agency that this is a really big part of what they want to try to achieve, and to link up in their sort of overall sort of flood risk management process, to try to bring these local interventions, these small scale interventions in, but at a catchment scale. So cumulatively, they make a really big difference.
Fantastic, Bruce. And there's a question here from Andrew, which is around sort of sustainable forestry, I guess. And it reminds me of the stat that 10% of all global carbon emissions are due to deforestation. So the question here rightly being posed is, as the demand for timber, particularly in, for example, construction projects increases, how do we make sure that's done in the right way, the most sustainable way, and engaging with the industry and foresters in particular? Who'd like to come in on that?
I can start, if you like, Munish, just from a previous experience again as well. So just before I joined Aviva, I worked for Argent, and we were looking at some investments as a part of our carbon removals strategy, and I think actually there's a real good investment case from that perspective, that you can have carbon removals in a forest that also has commercial forestry element to it, and the combination of the two things, and if they're done well and you work with a woodland trust or someone else, and especially adhere to the woodland code, then that can be a really good investment, because you are taking the carbon that you need out of the atmosphere, but you also have the commercial woodland element, and the combination of those are a really good case for someone like an Argent who's trying to do carbon removals.
Thank you. Nikki, the role of sustainable forestry from the Climate Change Committee's point of view?
I mean, it is absolutely crucial, and we do see wood in construction to be an important part of getting to net zero, and so actually scaling up our use of wood, but sustainably. So the Forestry Commission have got some fantastic standards that are important to ensure that that timber is produced sustainably. And something else that we also need to consider here is the role of biomass. So I'm sure you've seen in the news about certain biomass fuels being burnt, and it not being too good for biodiversity if it's being imported from countries that don't have as good standards as us in protecting nature. So I think we at the CCC are really looking forward to the government is due to produce the biomass strategy soon, and that's hopefully going to address some of our concerns around securing sustainable biomass. So I think, like I say, all of this does need very good oversight from government to ensure that all of these measures are sustainable and are not having any negative unintended consequences.
Thanks, Nikki. And exactly the point around unintended consequences being made by James Cowan in the comment that he's just made. Thank you, James. Bruce, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to maybe just sort of add that oversight is really important, but I think this comes down to having that holistic view at a larger scale than individual fields or land plots, because the right trees in the right place. I think what we need to be looking at in the discussions is around optimizing the benefits in any given location, which will be determined by the topography, altitude, rainfall, geographic location, etc. And it might be that we have areas of land that we focus on timber production, we focus on food production, trying to maximize and optimize other value from that land, but something takes a priority. I've done quite a lot of work with someone called Professor Ratan Lal, who heads up the Carbon Management and Sequestration Centre at Ohio State University. If you haven't seen him speak, he's a fantastic speaker, and he has this phrase at the moment: we need to produce more from less to make space for nature. And I think that really kind of sums this up. I think, food waste is part of that discussion, but reducing the extent of land we require for agriculture by eco-innovation, by regenerative agriculture, all these sort of things will make space for other things to happen in the landscape, whether that's nature or a combination of timber and nature. And these aren't mutually exclusive. And I think that's a really key message.
Great. That feels like a poignant place to pause the sort of question and answer session. Thank you so much. And also for answering questions in the Q&A itself, really admirable. One of the stats that I really like is around the use of trees, particularly in urban locations, and adding nature-based solutions, I guess, in our cities. Is one mature tree in a summer's day like today can provide the same cooling as 10 air conditioning units without the side effects of the global warming that comes with air conditioning. And that for me really is talks about the value of urban greening more than anything else. And then there is, of course, strong evidence now from the ONS, from some work they did probably about 18 months ago, showing the value, the economic value of property, particularly residential property, increasing the closer it is to green space in cities in particular. So the economic, the social, the natural case is really strong for all this. And that's kind of a segue into inviting each of our panelists for 30 seconds to give one closing statement, and then handing back to you, Ami, as the chair. Nikki, we'll start with you, then Bruce, then Claudine.
Sure, maybe I'll be less than 30 seconds. In that my only hopefully thing that you'll take away from this is dealing with the joint nature and climate crisis is absolutely crucial for the survival of humanity. We depend on a stable climate and a biodiverse planet for our health, wealth, and our economy. That's all I have to say.
Powerful. Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, I struggle to top that. I think my parting comment would be, if one thing to remember to think about is systems thinking. Think of the environment as a system. There's a phrase I use which is landscape literacy. And I think the more people who can look at a landscape, appreciate the beauty, but also start to understand and see the elements of function that are going on in that landscape, will be really key to driving that understanding, that engagement, and will facilitate the change that we need.
Great, thank you.
I agree with all that, and maybe just an additional comment about education and knowledge. Don't forget that educating people, keeping them close to nature, and increasing understanding of our dependence on nature is really important. We must try and do that any organisation that we're in.
Great. Handing back to you, Ami. What a great way to end today's session.
Thank you ever so much, Munish, for so adeptly chairing the panel. And thank you to all our panelists, Nikki, Bruce, and Claudine, for sharing your views. I hope everybody found this very interesting. I can see already that there's going to be a sequel to this. So you might find all our panelists and Munish back in the autumn or in the not too distant future to talk about adaptation. In the meanwhile, I'd like to wish everybody a good morning. We'd really welcome your feedback. Thank you for being so active on the Q&A. And one last point from me, if anybody is interested in joining us more actively at the ESG Forum at the Cambridge University Land Society, I'd really welcome your getting in touch via our website. We have an email address there. Please pop me a line and we can arrange a chat. Thank you all again and have a great morning.